I want to thank everybody for coming on a Monday evening in December, perhaps one of the hardest times of the year to get people to attend something. So I appreciate everybody coming, especially because I think this is it's going to be such a great event. I'm Jathan Sadowski. I'm both organizer and panelist for this event. It is I've put together my A team of people who are thinking really seriously and critically about the relationship between data governance and FIRE, right? And FIRE here being the finance, insurance, and real estate industries, right? And so, but before I introduce everybody, I do want to acknowledge a few things. One is that we are, of course, meeting here today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. You know, this sovereignty was never ceded. This is and will always be Aboriginal land. And I want to pay my deepest respects to any Aboriginal people here and Aboriginal leaders past, present, and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge as well that this event is made possible as part of the Emerging Technology Research Lab's SLOW Symposium that has been happening over the last couple of weeks and with more to come this week. And through that, we were able to bring out Salome Viljoen, who I will introduce very, very shortly, but also this event is co-badged and co-sponsored by the Center of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, which is why we are meeting here at RMIT as well. The ADM+S hub is at RMIT. But I'm very excited for this conversation, right? And I want it to be a conversation. I didn't want to have an event where we heard a bunch of 10-minute presentations that actually went for 20 minutes, and then there was no time for any real discussion or Q&A or anything like that. I wanted to just get to the good stuff, which is have a group of, I think, some of the most brilliant and exciting scholars working at different areas of this relationship between data governance and the FIRE sector, and see what comes out of us kind of thinking aloud and thinking together about some of the most critical issues and pressing concerns on and about something that is one of the most important kind of dynamics, relationships, problems in society today. And so, without further ado, I'm Jathan Sadowski. I am a DECRA fellow at Monash University, where I work on the political economy of insurance technology. So I'm really kind of bringing the I in FIRE here, right? And I'm joined by, to my left, your right, is Salome Viljoen, who's joining us internationally from the University of Michigan Law School, where Salome is an assistant professor and does a lot of work about, I like how you put it in your bio, you think about how the law thinks about data, right? And I think that is really sums up a lot of what you do, but more specifically, you do some of my favorite work on social theories of data, legal approaches to conceptualizing how we think about data governance and its relationship then to the tech sector, to other important industries like finance, targeted advertising, and just capitalism more generally, this kind of political economy, right? And so very excited to have Salome joining us in Melbourne this week. And then over here we have Megan Nethercote, who is a DECRA fellow as well in the Center for Urban Research at RMIT. And Megan is really bringing the RE of our group here. Megan has a DECRA working on the real estate sector and specifically looking at the buy-to-rent industry in Australia and in the UK. This convergence between the finance and real estate industry that is really, I mean, just having massive reverberations across the market for housing, and through that having massive consequences for people's lives in a real material and everyday sense when you have this crazy concentration, crazy amount of finance funneled into creating real estate and rental housing units as these assets, these commodities, these kind of abstract things to collect data about, to trade and sell and so on. And so Megan is doing, I think, some of the best work on this subject right now. And then last but certainly not least, we've got Jake Goldenfein from who is a senior lecturer and chief investigator in ADM+S Center at Melbourne University Law School. And Jake, of course, as well, is, I think, really rounding out our data governance, our legal approaches, thinking very seriously about topics like platform regulation, its connection to privacy, communication and media law, really getting into some of both the nitty-gritty mechanics of law and of how these technologies, how these systems actually work across from whether it's, ad tech, markets for design mechanisms with Salome, or looking at autonomous vehicles. I think really showing how we need more unified and real mechanical, technical understanding of these systems, both legal and technological. So with that, I think we're going to have a really fantastic conversation. We'll speak for about 45 minutes between us, and then we'll throw it open to the room for about 15 minutes of Q&A, and then stick around if you can after the talk starting at 7. We're going to have drinks and canapes and mingling and chatting just right out there. So stick around if you can. But I want to start off by thinking about the relationship between data and the FIRE industries by really honing in on an important relationship that I think that Salome, you really bring out in a paper, a draft paper called Valuing Social Data, that you and your co-author Amanda Parsons have been developing, that you are here workshopping at the Melbourne Law School on Thursday. But this paper is really a follow-up to the article you wrote on a relational theory of data governance, really thinking about data in a very serious social theoretical relational way, understanding these horizontal versus vertical relationships of data, right? Like, I like to think about it that these, the technology sector, credit brokers, risk underwriters, like these people, they don't actually care about you, right? Despite our kind of framing around data in these very like liberal and personal ways, right? It's about my privacy, about my autonomy, about my personal information. These sectors don't actually care about you as a person, right? They care about us as a population. That's where the real power of this data comes from. That's where all the efforts and resources to extract, capture, process, analyze, use that data is focused. And that's where the real value of that data comes from. And I think this is a relationship you then, in your new draft paper, really pull out much more closely, this relationship between data governance and value creation, or we might think of it as data capture and value capture, right? There's a real direct relationship there, which our critical analysis of data, our legal rulemaking and policy making around data really has not grappled with, or often not even recognized, that there is this crucial relationship between data governance and value creation or value capture. So I wonder if you could help kind of set the tone for understanding how this applies then to the FIRE industry by talking about that relationship some more.
Is this on? Okay, good. I'm pretty loud, but I guess everyone on Teams also needs to hear me. Thanks so much, Jathan, for that very warm welcome. And it's a real pleasure to be able to be here in Melbourne this week with you all, and not just because it's very cold in Michigan in December, and it's less cold in Melbourne somehow. Yeah. So as you kind of pointed out, the kind of things I've been really thinking about now really are an extension of some of my prior work, which was just kind of thinking about the disconnect between how technologists understand the value proposition of information, which really is about kind of like putting us into populational sort of relational relations with one another, and then sort of drawing insights and developing categories and acting back on us on the basis of that. And our legal regimes that structure how data is collected, governed, and used, and the kinds of rights and obligations that we kind of use to constitute and structure that activity, because law is always structuring and channeling productive activity. It just can do so more or less kind of consciously of what it's doing. And so my prior work was really just kind of pointing out these different relationships, and suggesting that like we kind of have a handle on formalizing a particular kind of legal relationship between ourselves and like Google, insofar as Google is like spying on me or whatever. But this is like a tiny tip of the iceberg of what's actually going on when like Google is interested in following me around the internet and tracking my shoe purchasing and all of that. Yeah, so the next sort of line of work that I'm doing with an international tax scholar, and I really recommend that everybody hang out with tax scholars more. It's really fun. It's super cool. Tax is like hugely important. Yeah, I've learned a lot from Amanda, and kind of the international tax perspective, is really sort of digging more into how this disconnect meets the value proposition of data. And so, again, that disconnect between our critical analysis, between our legal regimes, we have privacy and data protection rights for individuals on the one hand, and we have a political economy where data is absolutely core to value creation. Is sort of core to what it means to call the capitalism that we live under informational capitalism, right? That like mass information production and extraction is just core to value creation in the contemporary economy. And, I guess like what justifies me being at something on the FIRE sector is nowhere, I think, has that been more central to both sort of a natural extension of existing logics of accumulation, as well as kind of like really accelerating and taking up the capacities and the affordances of current technologies of datafication, as it has been in the FIRE sector. So it's really, that's the place where like the rubber hits the road in terms of more general, I think, business models of extracting value from data. And I guess where I come into all of this as a legal scholar is I just am sort of fascinated and puzzled by the law's inability to really it just sort of doesn't apprehend or index this relationship between data extraction and value creation, and that's really like core to what's motivating a lot of the things that then the law does pay attention to: privacy violations, the erosion of data protection, feeling like we're really on the back foot in a lot of these legal regimes. And so what I'm sort of very much interested in is like putting, where we put the cart before the horse, like just being like, what's up with this horse driving all of this stuff? Seems like we have to understand the business models. We have to understand the sort of value proposition of mass data extraction if we're going to get a handle on even the sort of traditional liberal concerns of privacy erosion and data protection erosion. So, I think being able to sort of ground that conversation specifically in a sector that has been at the forefront of doing all of that will hopefully be really fun and helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think on that as well, one of the relationships that you're trying to tease out in your work, I think, is really crucial. And a lot of so much of this as well is trying to get us a better language and a better way of understanding what is really intuitive and clear to us, right? That like surely sectors like finance, insurance, real estate have become so built on data because they see a value proposition there, right? They see there's something valuable happening there. But what is that value, right? I mean, I think, the understanding and trying to clear away some of the obfuscation of how something like data can be valuable is really difficult, especially when our conceptions of value, as you really put it in your work, right, and really well is, they tend to be very economic conceptions of value, very much about monetary value, right? Especially if we're thinking about sectors like finance that, they are the controllers of money, right? Surely all they care about is money and making more money. But how do you how do you convert data into money? It's not always clear that there's a way to actually do that conversion. You can go out on the market and you can sell that data. And, there is like a $200 billion data broker industry that is organized around doing exactly that, selling data as a commodity to other people who want that commodity. But that's also a really small part of the broader market for that is data driven, as we all say in our research. But why? Why is it data driven, right? Like, what is the value here that is actually trying to be extracted or exchanged or converted? And I think not only your work, but I think your work as well, Jake. I want to throw it over to you. What is like, where is some of this value for data coming from if it's not just a one-to-one conversion of that money, data to money kind of circuit, right? If what other forms of value do we see coming out? What game is the FIRE sector playing? What game is the tech industry playing that we are not even recognizing as a game, let alone like learning how to play, because our conceptions of value are still really stuck in a very simplistic, well, value equals money.
Hi. So nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's a very, okay. So we can start with the idea that the pathways between data and value are heterogeneous, diverse, lots of different things you can do. For a long time, we've thought about behavioral advertising as one of the primary mechanisms by which you can translate personal data into money. But I think what we're seeing now is a range of situations in which entities that have some sort of calculative apparatus are empowered to do that kind of translation. And I think, what Salome was talking about, that the sort of legal regimes that we have that touch just the tip of this iceberg, forget this. And so we have these data governance regimes that have always kind of been confused about and straddled data as some sort of valuable thing for which there needs to be a market, and data as a representation of a person that needs protection on sort of dignitarian grounds. And so if you look at like the early policy documents feeding into like the precursor to the European data governance laws, like the Data Protection Directive and later the General Data Protection Regulation, you see they're trying to construct a market while protect individuals at the same time. And in a lot of ways, and in a few different pieces, I've kind of made the argument that this is crazy. Like, people often talk about like law's pacing problem, that law fails to keep up with technology. I don't really think that's an appropriate way to look at it. It's that the law imagines what data is and what a person is and what a market is in just extremely different way to these industries, right? So in the law's imagination, data is like documents that you keep in a filing system. Effectively, that's kind of the imagination, the conceptualization that it's attached to. That there are these little bits of information that represent an individual in some way, and the individual should be authorized to construct their own identity that flows externally to them, and accordingly we give them these rights to control the contours of that information in that filing system. But once you get to finance, real estate, advertising, increasingly, AI, or Gen AI products, data is conceptualized in a completely different way. Like for advertising, for instance, the data is not a thing with value that you can store. Its value decreases exponentially quickly from the moment it's created. So data is actually, it's like a flow, right? It flows from an individual through to a business-to-business back end where all these different players in the value chain extract value from it one way or another. And it's different in all these industries. It might be about aggregating it with other data in order to make or to distribute audiences according to the probability of them doing a certain thing. It might be to like bet against people in finance markets. It might be about getting insights in finance markets. But we persist in regulating it as if this was like a market between you and a platform, you as a user, and then the provider of some system, which is the entity that's fundamentally constructing the data along the lines of how you behave. And that just has no grasp on the value proposition of data, which, you know, could be any of these things. It could just be something as simple as aggregating it into a data set for training an algorithm, which is extremely valuable business, right? Or producing data sets used for benchmarking algorithms, extremely valuable business. But our data governance law just doesn't have anything to do with that at all.
It makes me think as well around, so if we dive into the history of insurance very briefly, the insurance sector was always at the forefront. They were a vanguard for information technology, right? Some of the original databases were created by insurance companies, especially life insurance companies like Mutual of New York. Some of the original computer rooms were created by insurance companies. But those databases were the filing cabinets called the skyscraper, right? They were like these multi-level high filing cabinets, each one filled with index cards. Those index cards would be meticulously crafted by computers and then used to and then calculated to create risk models and underwriting for pricing, to create profiles of people, right? And so it was a filing cabinet with a kind of static index card that you might add something to. And of course, the computer rooms that were doing this compiling and calculation were rooms of women doing longhand, math calculations, right? These were the first databases in the first computer rooms. And the way you describe it is, I always chafe at that canard that law lags behind technology, because it simply is more that technology invests a lot of money in arbitraging law and lobbying against law, and changing the law and so on. So it's not law lagging, but I also think that you really nailed it as well. It's not law lagging behind technology. It's law conceiving of technology as something that technology is not anymore. So they're not trying to, they're not losing a race. They are, again, running a different race. They're playing a totally different game. They are still conceiving of databases as these original skyscraper filing cabinets at Mutual of New York. They are still in large part considering computers as just lots of people doing calculations and running if-then flowcharts, rather than something much substantially different at a mathematical level than that.
Can I say, like, I think about it as kind of like law's original sin is the construct of the rational consumer who's capable of entering into a contract that involves exchange of something for the capacity to construct data about that person, because whole markets are organized around this idea, and it's utter nonsense.
I do want to get Megan in here as well, and I think really thinking more like, we're looking at the foundations of this relationship between data and FIRE, between data and value, looking a bit abstractly at that relationship. I want to kind of meet in the middle and more concretely where the rubber really hits the ground here as well, and where something like this relationship between data capture and value capture, data governance and value creation, where we can really see it playing out, but also a real deficit of an understanding of what that relationship actually looks like. Why would a bunch of real estate investment trust or a bunch of real estate agents or landlords, like, why would they be interested in not just compiling a filing cabinet of about their tenants, but capturing a constant dynamic and ever-growing flow of data? But to keep the governance theme, I might start off, Megan, by saying what is the kind of governance and regulatory landscape for data in real estate look like right now?
So thank you. Thanks, Jathan. We had a very quick chat about this before, and I just said to Jathan, it's just really about a black hole. So I guess I could start by saying, like, I'm a housing researcher, and I sort of wonder how I fit in this panel of like legal scholars and data experts. But my work is always focused on how housing is being used as an asset and what are the repercussions of that. And increasingly, I've begun to feel like we can't understand and answer those questions properly without really looking at the technology and looking at the use of data. And I'm certainly not the only housing researcher to be doing so. There was a lot of work that was done after the financial crisis, especially Desiree Field's work, and she started talking about the automated landlord and the ways that big institutional investors were able to use technology to invest in, manage and trade all these geographically dispersed single-family homes in the US and elsewhere. And one of the questions, though, that her work and others raised for me is, yes, we've got all this digital technology, but what about the data? And also, where's the value in the data? So I began sort of looking outside housing research to people like Kian Birch, who was thinking about the way that data is given value or is made to be valuable, and asking, how does this relate to what's going on in housing, all this investment in housing? So my work really concretely looks at build to rent, which is an asset class of investment in institutional investment in real estate, and the way that institutional investors like private equity and super funds are using digital technology and data to extract value out of housing assets. And through that, and through this kind of growing interest in data and digital technologies, I've tried to unpick, like, what are the digital technologies that these big corporate landlords are using? What kinds of data are they extracting? And then kind of pushing beyond that to understand, okay, but how is this data, or to your point, these data sets made to be valuable? And I guess one way I've tried to conceptualize it is that traditionally landlords have always, we've always had the material enclosure of property and the extraction of monetary rents. Like, that's how we understand, traditional landlord activity. And to that, I think we can add this new digital enclosure of renters and rental properties and the extraction of data rents. And we can go into like what that looks like and how they're making money of that, and the repercussions, the particular repercussions and the need for regulation and legislation around that.
I think a little bit deeper, especially there's been a number of news stories recently. The Guardian had a big story, ABC recently had a big story, really calling attention to what the Guardian called a Wild West of data in the real estate industry, especially around the use by real estate agents.
Yeah.
Right. These kind of, if we're talking about real estate and landlords, then we're talking about intermediaries, and you can't really understand, especially the Australian real estate industry or sector, without thinking about the real estate agent as this other additional intermediary there who's kind of standing in between you, a tenant, and a property, right? and this kind of explosion of these intermediaries who all have an incentive and a desire to capture lots of data about people who might want to rent a house, but also capture lots of data about people who might want to, who might want to be landlords, right? And they're kind of serving as this point of bringing together data about tenants and data about landlords to serve this need of like, doing what, right? Like screening tenants, sweating the asset. Could you talk about like why is this characterized as a wild west of data, and how are they trying to use that to create value?
It has been heartening this year to see how much more media and publicity there has been in Australia and elsewhere around that early phase of like finding a rental, the application process, the data that tenants or prospective tenants are having to give over to landlords. And I guess where my research kind of tries to take it further is by looking at corporate landlords who they obviously deal not just with the application process, but through the whole life of your tenancy. And my work is focused on how much data they can collect and the different mechanisms that they're using. So obviously it's all the standard registration technologies, all the application data that tenants would usually submit. But after that, once you're a tenant, it's the conversation that you've had with the concierge, it's the parcel locker that you've booked, it's the key fob that you've swiped going in and out of your room, it's the CCTV and all the communal spaces of these large apartment buildings. It's everything that you've done on the resident app, that it's the additional outsource like rental payment processor who has insight into all your late payments, what the ways you're paying, all those sort of things. So my work sort of looked at the very significant, detailed, sophisticated profiles that these landlords can build on their tenants, perhaps especially in this corporate context of having single apartment buildings where they've got that full oversight, and both analogue through their ground staff there who are kind of meticulously keeping records of every analogue or in-person interaction they've had with tenants, right through to like the resident app and the tracking, who said what on the community forum about whatever, who RSVP'd to that community event. So you can imagine how extensive those profiles will be. And back to your question about how is that regulated? I'm obviously not a lawyer, but my sense is there's very little understanding about who's handling that data, especially parts of that process where landlords are choosing to strategically outsource, for instance, that rental payment piece of the puzzle, which adds value in other ways. They can play sort of good cop to the bad cop rental payment processor, and where your data sits and for how long. It's highly problematic.
My understanding as well is it's essentially no regulation, right? It's only Victoria has recently put in a law kind of restricting some of the data and decision making that real estate agents can make. Otherwise, it's a wild west because there is no real oversight or standardization of how that data is being used. I want to throw it back to you, Salome, because I think a lot of what we're talking about here around like screening tenants, sweating the asset, right? Getting as much money out of a rental property, getting people, choosing your risk, right? Who's a good tenant, who's a bad tenant. So a lot of this goes down to what you've called in your work, the prediction value of that data, right? It's not something that you exchange that data directly into money, but you do so through all these direct and indirect and obtuse ways of using that to then make predictions about value that may be actualized or risk that may be avoided at some point in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, tell me more about what they do with that data.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
yeah, I could. I mean, I should say, because I did say earlier that I was really interested in how they create value out of that. I suppose I didn't really tell you that part of it. So they create these very in-depth profiles, and the idea is, at least in theory, and we can talk about that gap between like their ambitions and what's actually going on in practice. But the idea is to then correlate like what type of tenant profile fits with the best operational efficiencies for these assets.
Right.
And so begins like a sorting and culling process, which has always existed to some degree in the rental sector. We've always had this kind of stratified system and this idea of like who the good tenant is. But this takes it to another level, and it introduces new criterion that we didn't have before about what good looks like, with the potential to obviously exclude and invisibilize tenants who don't fit that, but obviously who still need to be housed. So yeah, highly problematic.
Super interesting. Yeah, I guess to just fold that back into the original prompt that was lobbed my way, like, yeah, so in some recent work that Jathan's just referenced, we kind of do go through these different like scripts of value creation. And so much of, again, we kind of think of something has value when it sort of meets the market and gets a price. So like data is a commodity that can be traded by data brokers, which it is, and there's a big market for that. But so much of it is exactly this kind of stuff where you're cultivating what we call in the piece prediction value, which is really just like the value of sort of rendering, like apprehending people and then using that to like guide a decision either at the sort of firm level or about that individual person, oftentimes a combination of those two things. And that's valuable because it can help any entity either like do some combination of lowering costs or increasing profits. It can also, lower the risk of like entering a new market. And so it sounds like a lot of what's going on here is that.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of, I think the value of looking at that, and Jake touched on this a little bit, and you did too with the like Wild West kind of thing and the third party kind of thing, is that what makes this really interesting from like a legal perspective is that we can have a legal regime that's like, oh no, prediction, we're worried about that. That's like privacy and data protection regimes. But in the US, we're only worried about like prediction value or like the social control dangers of data. And I will restrict this to the US because I don't want to speak about other legal regimes in this like public-private divide kind of way. So like, private entities can collect gobs and gobs and gobs of data about me. The latest version of this panic that we're having in the US is like the post Dobbs, and Dobbs was the Supreme Court decision that overturned our constitutional protections to abortion. Now we're having this crisis about like fertility data. And the way it goes is like, oh no, all of these private entities, and I mean, I'm pregnant. I can tell you, as I've been telling people, pregnancy will tell on you, like what you're searching, how you're moving, how much slower I'm like waddling to the office. Like anyone could probably infer from any data stream about me, like you link two of them and you're like, oh, she's pregnant. So that's like a problem in the privacy regimes of the United States now, because certain states, including the state I grew up in, so I grew up in the state of Nebraska. Nebraska actually charged a teenage girl with criminally convicted her for getting an abortion on the basis of Facebook messages between her and her mother discussing getting these services. So it's true, we're like worried about it when it like meets the state. But we're not really thinking about it in terms of like the private cultivation of value. And so there's like that, we're aware of prediction value and we're worried about it, but only in this kind of like public-private divide kind of way. Meanwhile, we think about data value when it's like direct broker exchange value, because there we can like regulate it and tax people on the value and all of that, but only in that kind of direct exchange value way. What we're not good at capturing is exactly this kind of stuff, like how companies cultivate prediction value to lower costs, oftentimes by marginalizing and picking out like who are the bad tenants and not providing them services, or squeezing doing like extreme tailorization on their workers / independent contractors, creating these sort of like marginalized third-party characters to really kind of lower costs or to increase their profits. And this is where the consumer-facing stuff comes in, where, you know, Amazon is doing like soft first-degree price discrimination on all of us. And so they're just sort of able to capture the surplus out of each consumer regulation. And it's like that cultivation of value and those sorts of business strategies that fall into the disconnect, fall into the gaps of the types of stuff that our legal regimes do want to try to capture, which is like concern about social control, but only when that's the state doing it, and caring about value, but only when it's in this very traditional kind of like commodity meets the market. We have a dollar price, like, okay, now we can tax and transfer that value. I could go on forever about this, as you could tell, but I'm going to stop.
I think that's such a critical point. And like in my platform regulation class, when we talk about advertising, we sort of really try and make clear that the commodity being traded isn't data. The commodity being traded is attention. And the value of data is its capacity to price that attention. And this is sort of much the same. The value of the data that's circulating here is its capacity to effectively price tenants. I don't know if it necessarily works in the context of the pregnant person, but the public-private thing is a different question. And so, you know, we're always talking about data markets, but it doesn't make sense as a market unless it's in relation to the other thing that is the thing of value. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, like we have very nicely, I think, reached a really crucial point here where, you know, when we're talking about the relationship between data and value, I mean, we also have to be talking about the relationship between data, value, and power, right? Or rather, it's like value, data, power, because data kind of serves as this translator between value and power, right? And that is also this divide that you're bringing up around how we know about prediction value, but we're only concerned about it like in a legal sense, and often only in a social sense when it's the state doing it, right? Why? Because when we think the state, we think power. That's the realm of politics, and politics is the realm of power. But the private market, that's the realm of value and economy, and you know, and that is so it belies this like artificial distinction here between a political sphere and an economic sphere, rather than, of course, understanding the kind of political hyphen economic, right? Of understanding that these things are not separate spheres, but the same circle. They are the same sphere, and they are linked together through this relationship between power and value, things that have always been in relationship with each other, but now in, you know, informational capitalism, digital capitalism, whatever we want to call it, data is that really crucial intermediator there. It's a translator where sometimes data gets turned into value, sometimes data gets turned into power, but also those are not independent things either, right? Those are things that are in relationship with each other. And I think data as this way of helping us bridge the divide between these kind of artificial distinctions that we have. And again, I think this brings us back to why are we focusing and talking about the FIRE industry, right? It's because, you know, I think if we're going to talk about a relationship between power and value, if we're going to talk about one that is extremely materially important at a systemic social level and on a kind of personal everyday level, we have to talk about finance, insurance, and real estate, right? These industries that have established themselves as these kind of universal regimes of governance in society, right? Insurance, what is insurance but this universal regime of risk governance that underlies and oversees everything that we do, right? What is finance but the ultimate mediator that brokers our access to life chances, to opportunities, right? To participation in society. And of course, what is real estate, but as well, the gatekeeper to the essential services that we need to live and reproduce and actually be a society. So these industries have set themselves up as some of the most powerful in the world, and they are able to translate that power into value. This is why they are also the biggest industries in the world as well. And increasingly, that relationship happens through data as this intermediary, through a language of power and value. And so I think that actually brings us that time for Q&A. That was a pretty nice little wrap up there. There's still so much that we can get into here, right? We're just breaching the topic of two really, really big topics, trying to think about the relationship between them in new ways, right? I think as well, like, it's part of the power of some of this, of the really good work that the three of you are doing is taking things that intuitively make sense. We see them, right? Whenever you try to get a house, you're like, this is such a convoluted process. I'm having to hand over so much of my information, so much of my life to these people, right? The same is said with platforms, right? People would distrust them. The same is the case with all of this, right? Like there's an intuitive sense data that's got some value, but we don't know how this relationship exists, which means we don't know how to critique it, which means we don't know how to make rules about it. We don't know how to rein it in. We don't know how to understand it because the relationship has been obfuscated in various ways. It's intuitive, but it's not apparent, right? And so I think our conversation, the work that we've collected up here is in many ways trying to breach that obfuscation, to give us the language to understand that. But I think I want to throw it out. We do have a roving mic, Noni at the back. So I want to throw it out to anybody in the audience for a question.
Hey, thank you very much. My name is Aitor. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the center, Melbourne Law Node, as Jake. Once upon a time, I would have said, hey, this is terrible, but also it could be amazing. No, I mean, this technology detecting that you are pregnant, but also connecting with the communist housing, public, decentralized AI, assigning you a childcare, and all of this. That was my previous me. Now I'm more like put all the data centers on fire. But I wonder, what do you think about? I mean, you have described our reality. I wonder what is your mood towards this reality, and yeah. Or we are now in a post digital socialist future, because 2 years ago we had these discussions, but I think now we are more reluctant. I can detect from, Hassan, but other Paris March, many other people are like in a more agnostic attitude towards technology. With Marian Merchant, we don't believe anymore in this thing.
For me, it's become very hard to imagine a technological reality that isn't a corporatist one. And, the idea of like a socialist technological infrastructure, I think now feels more and more impossible. So yeah, burn them down.
I think, and I know your work speaks directly to this, Salome. I think part of that sense of like hopelessness or agnosticism to it, right? Which I think that kind of apathy, agnosticism, all of the claims around privacy is dead, what does it matter? I think those are actually like self-defense mechanisms, right? When you're confronted with a system that you seem to have no agency in, no power over, no say in, and things just happen to you, why would you expend what little mental energy you have worrying about it, right? You just become apathetic to it, inert to it, and what can you do, right? I think that there is very good reason why people feel that way. I think as well that what we're identifying here, and I think what you're identifying, Aitor, is this relationship that we have between capital and technology, right? That like the imperatives of capital are the imperatives of technology, because technology is designed for purposes by people who have values and goals in mind, right? And so their imperatives, their interests, their desires give us are materialized through the technologies that are then created, right? But that's also not to say that like that's all technology can ever be, or that's what innovation looks like. I think there's a kind of silent modifier there of that's what capitalist innovation looks like. That's what capitalist technology looks like, right? It does the kinds of things that we've been talking about up here because that's the imperative of capital. The difficult thing, but the necessary thing, is to try to disentangle that modifier from the noun it's modifying, right? Which also means like it does require conceiving of very different forms of technology, very different forms of innovation, because these are not just icing on the cake. They are the kind of the core descriptor of the technological system. But at the same time, it's not an impossible, nor is it a nicety to just kind of imagine what different modifiers could be and what those could actually be materialized as. And I know, Salome, your work is actually very dedicated to that kind of prescriptivist legal, you lay out the critical, descriptive, analysis, but you always end, I think, in a really, not just a throwaway way, but a really trying to take seriously what would a prescriptivist legal regime for different alternative technologies look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, my short answer is like, capitalism's gonna capitalism, capitalism gonna capital. And like, one of the prevailing sort of stupidities of Silicon Valley is always like technologists thinking they can like dupe capital to their own ends. You saw it with like internet, like the early internet people. You saw it with the social media companies. They're like, haha, we're gonna trick advertisers into fueling our like universal communication systems. And you saw it with cryptocurrency, libertarians.
Outcompete capital.
Yeah, and now you're seeing it like the latest kerfuffle with OpenAI, where they were like, oh no, we took $10 billion from Microsoft and now they want to turn us into a for-profit company. Yes, they do. So like, yeah, I get that. But, I mean, I think for me, so part of what I like take away from like my point of pointing out that like data is deeply relational, and these technologies and these companies are hitting on a very different kind of subject from the traditional legal subject, is actually a very positive one, which is to say, like, I think they're touching on like a deep truth and like something kind of amazing that is like a vindication of just how deeply social we are, like just how deeply socially constituted we are, to which, like, for me, the political response to that, of course, ought to be solidarity and sociality, and not like, retreating into the like Margaret Thatcher, there is no digital society, only individuals and families, but to sort of at least like hold open a capacity for what the insight of just how deeply socially constituted and how powerful, like, that's true. And it's because that's true that these companies are able to sort of monetize so much of our sort of social relations in this way. And, I think sort of a long-term ambitious goal that I have in sort of disconnecting monetary value from prediction value is to say that I think so many of the problems that we run into are the problems of yoking the kinds of questions we ask and the kinds of quote unquote problems that we're trying to solve using these technologies to this ultimate value proposition that has to cash out as profit. When to me, it gets the problem exactly backwards. And so you have a bunch of companies marshaling powerful technologies that touch on deep facts about us, which is that we are deeply socially constituted beings, and puts that in service of some sort of profit motive. And so they're creating like badly formed answers in search of questions, and in the meantime going about and creating massive social disruption in the wake of that. But I suppose I kind of remain, at least like in theory, positive about the capacity for technologies designed with very different sort of briefs and very different goals in mind, actually solving pressing social questions. My like glib thing that I think I say is like, and we have a planet of 7 billion people heading into climate crisis. That has logistical components to it. It has resource allocation questions to it. And there are ways in which technologies of prediction and allocation can help us settle what will inevitably be challenging questions around that fairly, and not in service of sort of intermediating all of that through like the very stupid logics of profit allocation. But that, and I think technologies can and will play a role in helping to make a less livable planet potentially more livable. But you know, it requires yoking them to very different logics than they're being yoked to currently. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Jake is skeptical.
I'm skeptical because I look at things like the EU AI Act, which is supposed to be this sort of bright shining light. And but you know, it's tied to this very sort of auto-liberal mechanism in which we regulate these things as if they were products in a market. And we do it in the name of consumer safety. So we make sure to deal with the most egregious, the most harmful, the most problematic aspects of these technologies. But nowhere in this whole regulatory system is there space for some sort of democratic discussion about what we might want these things to do. There's nowhere in this, like, there's nowhere for people to, there's no space for people to have any influence over how technology is being developed. We're just able to contribute to delineating the absolute boundaries, right? That's our political role. And I 100% agree that, you know, technology clearly is going to play a role in whatever future we have. And hopefully that's an okay one. But it's hard to see it from here.
An okay future. You're setting a high bar there, Jake. I want to throw it back out for another question, but to this point as well, it is the case that yes, like a lot of this is extremely complex, and it requires you know, gold medal level mental gymnastics to kind of imagine what could be different. But also, that's not the fact for everything. A lot of this is also extremely simple and very straightforward, right? And I think there are some examples, right, about how we could make really simple and straightforward changes to existing technologies and result in like materially improved society for people. I think about, for example, if I bring it back to insurance, right? There is a big investigation by ProPublica in the U.S. They've been doing a series on the healthcare industry and the insurance industry, doing a lot of just amazing investigation. But they uncovered an algorithm at Cigna, which is one of the major U.S. health insurers, which is an automatic rejection algorithm, right? So if your medical claim was under a specific dollar threshold, your claim was automatically rejected, and then it's up to you to go through the appeals process, which has a fraction of a percentage point of success because nobody goes through the appeals, because the appeals process is itself extremely labyrinthian and impossible to navigate. And so, you know, and for Cigna, this was a massive money saver, right? Because there was a human medical doctor reviewing all of these claims, but they spent about 1.2 seconds on each claim reviewing it, right? And so it saved Cigna a huge amount of money, because if you had a small claim under like $500, automatically rejected, they're never paying that out, nor are they having to actually pay an expensive medical doctor to do review. But this system was created by a private equity guy who became an executive at Cigna because he's like, I have a way to save you a lot of money with just a flip of a switch. And it was a flip of a switch because Cigna actually, for a very long time, had the same system in place, but it was set to accept, not reject. If your claim was below a certain dollar threshold, it was automatically accepted because it cost more to have a human doctor review it than it did to just pay it out, right? And then the private equity guy said, you fools, turn the switch to reject and you'll make a lot more money. If you just flip that switch back to accept, that suddenly improves a lot of millions of people's lives overnight, right? Same thing happening across the Europe right now with Lighthouse Reports has been working, doing amazing investigative reporting on these welfare fraud detection algorithms being used in the Netherlands, in France, in the UK, in Belgium, all over, right? And they're all very much alike because they're often all made by the same management consultants and so on. And they're all set to detect fraud and then reject and investigate and penalize people that are doing welfare fraud. You could easily reverse that system, detect people in need, people who are not receiving the welfare that they are legally due, which is most people. Most people do not actually receive the level and types of welfare that they are legally due. And so it's not welfare queens, it's welfare paupers, right? People who are not received. So, but again,
I'm not sure that's easy.
but it is easy in the sense that it does not require creating like a new school of technology or a new discipline, right? It does not create. What I mean is it doesn't require lots of new knowledge and imagination and doing a lot of sci-fi world building to conceive of what is ultimately a binary solution, setting a 1 to a 0 to a 1, and immediately having a big material impact on people's lives. But I think our discussions about these are often, for good reason, focused on how inordinately technical and complex all of this is, right? How we need generations and generations of new knowledge to conceive of it. But in fact, there are lots of intermediary steps, hundreds and thousands of intermediary steps that could happen overnight and are not mutually exclusive from also doing the big work. But I want to I think we started a little bit late, so I do want to, one more question, and then we can go to net chat. Yeah. Oh.
Mine's for,
We'll grab both.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
I'll pass it back.
Yeah.
My questions, my comments, quite simple. Isn't that where the state comes back in? So the state comes back in enacting, and I think there's lots of different ways that works. The other is in not looking at digital or AI law, but looking at different forms of law. So housing is a human right in Finland. That changes fundamentally how the algorithms are allowed to work.
Yeah. No, Mark, please.
You know what? I'll ask, but there was one over here. No, but okay. Yeah.
So my question is, what is the role of security technologies, and why is not in the title securities such as cameras or I don't know, floor detector racks or whatever, or maybe it's not at the level of finance, insurance, and real estate, or why not?
Yeah, I mean, the point about the role of the state, I think, is absolutely right. I mean, I think part of what I like about being a legal scholar is I feel like, in a sense, you have to be prescriptivist because law is already structuring the world we have. And law and thinking about law cannot be separated from laws are just the ways that we enact social demands in the world. And so to Jake's point, like, yeah, that requires a different state. I'm like, yes, exactly. These are not like technological challenges. They're questions of like, what kind of, we do live in a society. What kind of society do we want to live in together? We are being socially kind of constituted through our laws. How do we want to be constituted? What kinds of social demands do we want to enact? And again, I don't think that those are like technological problems. Those are not problems with technology, which is why I don't think I'm pessimistic about technology. I'm sort of actively trying to think about and push forward and theorize different ways of articulating and enacting social demands through law and legal reform. So yes.
I mean, yeah, I 100% agree. And the state question is critical. I mean, instead of having welfare fraud detection algorithms, we could just pay people decent welfare. That's a decision that the state could make. and sometimes we get caught up in these technological questions, like the Robodeck question. You know, the issue was not this problematic algorithm. The issue was not the absence of a human decision maker. The issue was a punitive political culture. And I don't know if there's a technological fix to that. There's probably not. With respect to the security questions, you know, security participates in this in a lot of ways, and I've written something that will come out early next year about facial recognition and how all our privacy language and privacy thinking in how it addresses facial recognition is oriented around this idea that, oh, we might lose our right to anonymity in public space and stuff. But really what the privacy thinking ought to be addressing is the fact that our images are constantly collected and aggregated into data sets that have very significant value that are used to train and benchmark facial recognition algorithms. And it's the same issue that our privacy law doesn't have the conceptual chops for dealing with this frontier of value creation.
I can just add on to that, like there's a lot of surveillance technology used in housing, and there's this real tension between how it's marketed as like luxury surveillance, and we opt in, you know, like we do with an Apple Watch or that sort of thing. Meanwhile, in the background, this stuff's happening, and certainly I've heard plenty of cases with people that I've interviewed in the housing sector who can report, like the landlord of a build-to-rent apartment noticed some comings and goings of people, and they were very quick to scrape all the data that they needed to take that case like straight to the police. And yeah, that obviously raises a lot of questions about your own data privacy in what you consider like the private spaces of your home. Yeah, that's an issue.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for coming, and join us right outside for some drinks and canapes and more chatting. So thank you all.